Greetings and welcome to a wistful and very dramatic episode of Genre Grinder. I am no bird, and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will, and my name is Gabe Powers.
And then reader, she blogged with him. My name is Kristine Fisher.
And if you couldn't tell from our wonderful intro there, my guest this time is once again my significant other, Kristine Fisher. And unlike last time where she had to fill in for a canceled guest without knowing much about what was going on, we're covering a subject she's actually familiar with, and that genre is Gothic Romance. I was personally unclear on what constituted Gothic Romance when we started, so I did my own research, and I found a surprisingly concise and complete definition of the literary tradition, and the Toledo Library's website is credited to Claire F. I don't know what the F stands for. If you know her, let me know, I guess. I will link to it in the description for the podcast on iTunes and Stitcher and all that stuff. So the short version is...
The lead could be male or female. They would appear emotionally immature, like an ingenue, perhaps thankless or put upon, virginal in nature, and they're being challenged by the outside world. And they're hoping to meet someone or come upon a situation where they can transition out of the world where they're in. The secondary character who they meet or run into, they might initially be quite remote, an unlikely catch for this lead character, perhaps even an anti-hero, brooding, guarded, and protective of something or against something else. The house that they happen to own within their family isolate and can kind of magnify their anti-hero feeling. And once they, as a couple, enter the house, the image in the reader's mind and the image on the screen goes dark. You can chart about maybe the first quarter of a film or a book when it happens. It's like the mood and the look changes as the lead character goes outside of their sense of home.
And they, the love interest is referred to as the Byronic hero, not to be confused with the Bionic hero. And that is named after anti-hero type developed by poet Lord Byron. And his qualities usually include some sort of violent temper, prideful and seductive nature, that, like you said, a solitary existence, and some sort of sinister secret.
Usually when the lead character enters the house, there's a threat of persecution or death towards them. And they're taking the role of a teacher, oftentimes a governess. I think 2 out of 3 of the movies were their governess.
Mm-hmm.
And then they marry the secondary hero really suddenly, like a whirlwind romance. And then oftentimes the friends or the relationships that lead character left behind, they want to know why they left. And the real horror of the entire medium comes from a source of old aristocracy, religion, and something that the area of the people want to hide or forget or like keep away from them.
Right. The location, the Gothic part, really comes from the location, which is like either a castle or some sort of spooky mansion. I burped again, man. The second time we recorded this, I burped both times. And yeah, these are usually passed down by generations to the Byronic hero. And the building is separated not only from society by location, but by the surrounding area, makes it hard to get to for usually natural reasons. Like it's on a craggy cliffside. There's some sort of really thick forest. There's wolves in the area, as in one case. Or there's just something as simple as a moat.
Yeah, and the other thing is that with the Brontes, I don't know if I'm saying it right. I choose to say Bronte, even though it's...
I'm going to say Bronte.
Okay.
It's just what I've heard. Yeah.
Bronte, or Bronte.
They're British, but what is the name?
Scottish.
Scottish?
Yes.
Okay, I was thinking it was like Dutch or something because it has an umlaut sometime.
That was their dad's doing.
It's just for fun. Like Motorhead.
He changed his name, and he was a curate. He was like a preacher who lived in the area of like an abbey.
Okay.
So he like he looked after the abbey, and he had to create his own name. Like in a religious order, you can sometimes change your name.
I should be saying we're talking about the Bronte sisters, who
Father, yeah.
their father, the Bronte sisters, which we'll get into in a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
They more or less define our understanding of Gothic romance,
Yes.
not our understanding of Gothic literature.
The Gothic literature was actually started by a guy named Horace Walpole.
Yep.
Yep.
Nice name.
Yep. In 1764, a book called Castle of Otranto. And it would be his legacy that he really hated. He would call that book a trifle. He wanted to forget about it and just kind of like disavow it as not being his. He said that it was like it was a translation of a originally Italian story, and it featured brooding characters reflecting on the past, having prophetic dreams, thunderstorms, and a dark, mysterious castle. And the audience, the reading audience, just ate it up, and they made plays after it. They did retellings, and it just really took off from then on.
Well, that's an issue that still exists today, where somebody's trash that they made for fun ends up being the thing that they're remembered for.
Yep. Or Horace Walpole.
So it's like penny dreadful type literature, pulp literature, and so Gothic literature fits the pulp thing by the time we get going.
But then there's like posturing, like they try to make it seem better and more honorable than it really is. It's usually in response to something going on in society that they're like, they'd rather look to the past and be like how life was before this big change, like industrial revolutions or war. It's like their response, like, oh, remember when things weren't so bad? That's what a Gothic romance is.
So it's the happy days of 18th century literature.
Yes, sometimes 19th, early 19th.
Or the Stranger Things now, like
Yes.
any sort of nostalgic literature, entertainment media that probably ignores all the bad things about that era.
Yes.
And celebrates the fun things. So another thing that often happens in these stories is that there will be the house itself will be in disrepair, and it will have a staff of servants, and
sometimes they're with the lead character and they want to like help them like as a stable part. They're like, they recognize that they're going to be the lady or the man of the house and marry their master or mistress eventually.
Make life better for them.
Or they can like be against them. Like, you'll never be as good in so-and-so, who's a prior lead to this house. You'll never measure up to who they were.
And I didn't find an example of this, but I'm sure that there's an example of a servant who is in love with the hero, and he or she is trying to mess up the thing. I can't think of an example of that because Rebecca is she really in love with?
Yes.
I thought that she was really in love.
Remember that part when she was like, the lady touched this pillow?
No, she's in love with the dead wife. Oh. She's not interested in the dude.
Oh,
I'm master. Sure there's also an example of a servant who's interested in the master and doesn't think that this woman's good enough.
I think they're interested in the master's like retaining what role they have, but not like wanting them for themselves. There's like a big like upstairs downstairs like barrier between one another. Like, they can't imagine something like that.
And another way to think of this is if you're someone listening and you still you're not familiar with this, a Downton Abbey. If it was told from one of the many characters that comes into Downton Abbey,
like a guest.
If it was told from their point of view, there would be a certain Gothic romanticism. There would be more of a Victorian romance, I suppose, in Downton Abbey's case, but it's still similar.
Post-Victorian, maybe Edwardian.
Yeah, there's still a similar dynamic going on. We're just seeing it from a different point of view. And then some of these stories are horror stories, and there is a supernatural element. Often has something to do with the location. It's some sort of haunting, usually. So it's either the family of the master, the hero, Byronic hero. If he's truly a villain, it is a lover or wife that he killed.
Yes.
A good example of this that we're not going to cover, so I'll just mention it, is Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak. is a perfect encapsulation of how horror elements can fit a Gothic romance. And I know that he was really, in interviews, he was really sure to explain that that movie was a Gothic romance that happened to be a ghost story, not just a ghost story.
I think what's important too is that sometimes the house is a character and that it influences the people inside of it. Like windows close, or there's a storm that like blows into somewhere, or it's like the house is forcing them to do something supernaturally, or putting them into a trance, or phantom voices and laughter and music, and it just has an effect on the people inside to either keep them there, to see it as being a refuge, or forcing them out because they don't belong.
Right. So it's a lot of Poe stories that have that kind of that the location itself has a curse, even if it's not a literal curse, even if it's just like a emotional curse.
And then with like the telltale heart, you're imbuing something from like a corporal body into a house, and the house is reflecting it and amplifying it. Like, this doesn't belong here. You need to like reverse something or to make things right again.
Right, which is a common ghost story thing. So, I guess the point we're trying to get, I'm trying to get across here is that, hold on a second. Hey, get down.
Frankie!
Get down. Get all the way down. No, you're still up there. Hey! That's what I thought. Sorry. I don't know if I'll cut that out, but if I don't, our cat was the one spot she's not allowed.
And she's a black cat.
Yeah, she is a very Gothic cat. So yeah, the point being that Gothic romance can be Gothic horror, and Gothic horror can be Gothic romance. But all Gothic movies aren't Gothic romances.
No.
There can be Gothic movies that are war movies. There can be Gothic movies that are thrillers, that are horror movies.
And I'm making a real effort to try to not assign it to the lead always being a woman.
Right.
That is very often not the case. Not even like a cis male with like female like weak or like simpering qualities. It can honestly be a man or a woman in either role.
Right. And so I guess a good example of some overlap, the original Dracula is a Gothic horror, depending on which angle you read it from or it's told from. And then that's a case where the man is that is a male/male Gothic romance.
Yes.
Carmilla,
Okay.
Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to a certain degree.
Frankie's wheezing.
Uh-oh, now the cat's barfing.
No, just wheezing. I think that something to consider, whether it's Gothic romance or Gothic horror, is that either way, there's a big question that needs to be addressed. What's being hidden? What is being shielded? And from one person to another, why they're deciding to do that? And if the lead character escapes it, or they get away from where they need to be, or if they succumb to it, or they let it win, or they glom themselves onto the house or to the area.
Yeah, that's something that I hadn't thought about, that none of these stories are specifically happy endings or sad endings. It's all across the board.
There's times where they're in it, they're settled, they're at a really good place, and something happens to like break their dream or make them leave. They go back to where they were at the start of the story, but the house just brings them back.
Yeah.
Or some sort of situation happens where the secondary hero realizes what they've done, and then they ultimately go back.
I again, another note I made myself is that if you really want to boil this down to the easiest to understand example that everybody's seen, Disney's Beauty and the Beast is a Gothic horror. And the only real problem there is that there's often a secondary love interest in these stories, and he or she is usually the better choice for the hero.
Gaston is not the better choice.
Yeah, Gaston is an asshole. Gaston, it actually fits part of the role that the Byronic hero would have, that he's really full of himself. But the Beast fits all the other stuff, and that he has a violent temper and a dark past and something he's hiding.
Gaston represents the area where Belle is from.
Yeah, he's the the familial element, the thing she's trying to
great
escape.
big catch, that the best that her village has to offer her.
Right. So, we were going to cover a pretty wide range of movies, but as soon as we started talking about this and taking notes, I decided to limit us to what I would call movies from this classic era of these. These movies have been around since the silent era, and a lot of them are adaptations. And we will cover more modern versions at another time. I just kind of cut them off the list. So the 3 movies we're going to be talking about here are from the sound era. They are the most classic of all these stories probably is Jane Eyre, and we're going to cover the 1943 Robert Stevenson version of that. And then Dragonwyck is another older story. And we will be covering the 1946 Joseph Mankiewicz version. And then because this is my podcast, we had to throw in an Italian one. So I picked Mario Bava's The Whip and the Body. So from there, we are going to jump into Jane Eyre, 1943, directed by Robert Stevenson.
It has always been true, but never more true than it is right now. The pictures you enjoy most are based on the most widely read novels. Recall Grapes of Wrath, Gone with the Wind, How Green Was My Valley, This Above All, Rebecca. Great pictures, all of them. And now 20th Century Fox brings you Jane Eyre, based on the most widely read novel in our language, printed and reprinted 100 times, most recently by the Book of the Month Club. Its immortal lovers are played by the most discussed celebrity in the entertainment world, and the actress who won the Academy Award in Suspicion.
Whatever happens, do not open a door. Hide a door.
What's that doing here? No one is allowed up here. Understand? No one. Get thee down. Get thee down.
Jane, strange, almost unearthly thing. You that I love as my own flesh.
Don't mock me.
Ever rough or blush. It's you I want. Answer me, Jane, quickly. Say, Edward, I'll marry you. Say it, Jane. Say it.
I want to read your face.
Read quickly. Say, Edward, I'll marry you.
This was developed by David O. Selznick, who's known for Gone with the Wind, and Hitchcock's Rebecca, which is probably actually my personal favorite of what I've seen from this era of Gothic romance stories. It was co-written by John Houseman and Stevenson himself, with some script doctoring by DeWitt Bodine.
And Aldous Huxley.
He was the script doctor on it, I believe. Mm-hmm. And playwright Keith Winter was also a script doctor. So there was a lot of work done on this.
And when filming occurred, Orson Welles offered some ad-libs.
Of course.
For Mr. Rochester, and he had before played it in radio.
Right, so Orson Welles is the lead in this, and Orson Welles and is really the reason this got made, because Selznick lost interest in it basically, and it was sold off to William Getz at 20th Century Fox during World War II when everybody was losing money, and it was actually sold as a big package of developing stories, scripts, and even star contracts, and that included Hitchcock, Gene Kelly, and Ingrid Bergman. So this was just sort of a thing, because there'd already been multiple versions
of things to draw from.
That was handed to 20th Century Fox, and Orson Welles doing it was the key component to get it made, basically.
Joan Fontaine had a lot to offer too. I think what I take from this movie is her reactionary face, how she just has these doting eyes that you can't fail her. She's like relying on you, and she's a fragile but outspoken when she needs to be sort of being. Yeah,
and I believe that I'm looking here. It says here that Welles he got a production credit, not a writing credit, but that he was actually responsible for some of the casting. So she might have been his choice. I don't know if that's for sure.
Is it likely that Orson Welles would have known the career that a small cameo like Elizabeth Taylor, what she would have?
Yeah, Elizabeth Taylor plays a little girl, and she's not even credited. I bet he didn't cast that role.
No.
I bet that was just the production. I bet he helped cast the leads. I bet that he helped because of who he was. Boy, I hope all that noise upstairs isn't being picked up by this microphone. Our upstairs neighbor has the kids for the weekend, and they are jumping everywhere.
No, the football's over.
Yeah. I would guess that he helped bring in the bigger stars, and I would guess that Fontaine was part of that. That's just a guess, though. But so yeah, this was a story by Charlotte Bronte,
Published in 1847.
and her pen name was
Currer Bell.
Currer Bell. And so Bronte. This is the first of the line of Bronte sister novels, correct?
Yes, even though technically they were released as like a trifecta.
Yes. So Emily wrote Wuthering Heights,
Yes.
which is also a very definitive Gothic romance. Basically, those two are the definitive Gothic romances of this era. You can throw in some Poe, because Poe did Gothic and Gothic romance.
About 10 years to 12 years before.
Right. And you can, because these are Byronic heroes, you can throw in him, I suppose.
Yes, some of his poetry especially.
But what we understand when we talk about Gothic romance is Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. And I personally was just more familiar with Jane Eyre, and I think you liked it better, so we decided.
Very, very much so. It's my favorite book.
So we decided to cover that instead. And then the youngest sister was Anne, who did...
Lots of poetry, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, in post, Agnes Grey.
Yes, Agnes Grey, which is her big novel, which is not a Gothic romance.
Not so much.
It's her, and so from what I understand, her work is more comparable to Jane Austen. And
Of sorts, kind of like a salt of the earth, gritty, metaphysical Jane Austen.
and so
Not
as
so much tied up in frivolity and going to balls and meeting with manor owners or rich people.
so she has the better feminist following of the three sisters.
Yes, for sure.
There's a really cute Kate Beaton comic. She does a lot of comics about Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights and the Brontes. And there's a cute one where all three Bronte sisters are looking at boys and saying, "Oh, look at him. He looks so brooding and dangerous." And Anne's just saying, "He looks like an asshole." And the other sisters are saying, "Oh, Anne, you're never going to catch a man that way."
That's her nature.
Yeah. So that was cute. Maybe I'll include some of those on the description too. And so I guess I also want to say that Gothic fiction in general, not just the romantic variety, is one of the few genres of literature that is fronted by women.
Yes.
I don't know if in the long run there's more women writing in it, but I think in the long run there's more women writing the important and famous stuff.
Outside of the Gothic horror of Fall of the House of Usher, for sure.
Right. So Poe has a big part. But Clara Reeve, Anne Radcliffe, how do you say that name? That French one right there.
Caroline Stephanie Felicite.
And then Mary Shelley,
Yes. And
everyone's favorite.
stupid, awful Sir Percy Blythe Shelley.
Right, and so he did writing, but Mary was the better. And then I guess the one I figured out, there's The Monk, which is by Matthew Lewis, 1796, is considered an important early, prototype 2 Gothic romance.
In a way that Castle Oronto is not.
I mean, yeah, those two together, I suppose. The Monk is one that kept on coming up every time I was... And there are movie versions of The Monk. I'm not familiar with the story or these movies.
I want to say that maybe an element between Castle Oronto and The Monk might have been the fetishization or the exoticism of Oriental cultures or Asian cultures. And the prospect of traveling to somewhere remote and building a castle or some sort of impenetrable place where you could just sit around and walk the halls by yourself.
Right. And yeah, I mean, I suppose the Brontes, they're Victorian era, correct?
Yes, slightly earlier. What had happened is that Charlotte was really inspired by her and her sisters and brothers being sent off to boarding school. And it was fronted by, usually, there was a religious element to it. There was prayers in the morning. There were brazenly cold baths in the middle of the day to get the tuberculosis germs flowing, get some damp in your lungs, and just make things generally awful because the kids were forced through rote memorization, a lot of forced punishments for like going south of like this perfect upstanding religious.
The rejection of religious themes is actually something that I want to talk about more for the second movie, just because I was surprised by how willing the Hays Code was to embrace it. Because the Hays Code was you had to be religiously respective, especially of Christian religions.
There's a wee bit in the very, very beginning of Jane Eyre where Agnes Moorehead makes an appearance. And she and her kind of gluttonous son reject the young Jane Eyre when she's still a child from their household as being ungodly,
Right.
Very, very heathen-like, lower class, not of their household. And you could say that Agnes Moorehead's motherly character is kind of vain, pious to a fault, and that her son is just making Jane Eyre's life awful, that the prospect of going off to a boarding school seems very, very welcome to her.
Yes, and also later on escaping... I mean, yeah, the idea of escaping any sort of religious indoctrination is a theme in these stories that probably didn't go down well at the time, and it goes missing from a lot of adaptations, again, because the rules for making movies at this time were very strict. And I still think you would have a lot of complaints if you made a version of Jane Eyre. Even the newest one, which was Kari Joji Fukunaga, the one with Michael Fassbender, even that one didn't really dive into the negative aspects of religion.
It's kind of apparent when she goes to school, to this boarding school. The friend of hers still dies, much like there was a school friend of Charlotte Bronte's when she went to school that kind of is mimicking the Helen character, but the fact that she dies of TB is indicative that 3 of her sisters died when they were at boarding school. Yet her father still advised that she go. It was just a fluke that her sisters died. Why not?
Well, and it's easier even back then to make fun of and the idea of boarding schools being hellscapes. I mean, there's actually a thing about Jane Eyre that almost goes into a totally separate subgenre of British and French, I would say, movies, which are movies about the hells of boarding school, which is actually something. The next thing we're recording, I'm recording with Tyler Foster, who some of you may know. We're going to talk about high school movies, and I was trying to make a list of high school movies, and I realized that this was like a totally separate thing. There's all these movies about how boarding school is just violent and vile and horrible, and that's even in movies that take place in what was then the modern era. It was still looked at as just this cesspool of bad omens and shit.
And the movies really kind of mollify the characters, and in a high school film made in the U.S., they're allowed to be themselves.
Yeah.
They're more dynamic characters, and it's not the fact that they're being held back in school. It's the fact that they get to express themselves.
Yeah. And I suppose, so Orson Welles is the big star here. Jane Fontaine, Angus Moorhead. Welles is, again, the centerpiece here, and Welles plays it really hard. Like, you said that he had playing this character before.
On radio. When I was watching the film and we were taking notes, I said, when they meet together in his moors with the fog and his dogs just running up to her, and the horse comes up and rears in her face, I put underlined sex exclamation point, because it's like, here I am.
Right.
This is me. I am the master of this domain. This is where I live. This is my house. It's like a copy of it's like a representation of who I am.
And he has this aloof sexiness that, and he negs her basically. But in this case, he's not negging her. He's not doing it to lessen her value.
No.
He's doing it because he's kind of a bad person.
And I think he's really trying to shield his naivete as who he was when he was younger. He's saying, I made stupid decisions, things you don't need to know about, that I just need to, make penance to
Right.
in my older age.
He's
And
hiding his own problems rather than doing this as a way to get her to be interested in him.
what he wants is just a person to have a good conversation with.
And so his dark secret, we find out, because of course the two of them fall in love, because that's the story.
Yes.
And again, this is a shortened version of the story, because it's a pretty short movie. It's only a little over 90 minutes. And it's not a huge book, but it's a book.
Yes.
So that part moves a little fast, but then they go to get married, and the big shocker is that he's already married.
Yes.
And the whole movie, there's some sort of spooky thing upstairs that she's like, what is that? What's going on? Everybody's like, it's none of your business. You don't need to worry about it. And it turns out he has
His first wife is half Creole. Her name is Bertha. They wed when he was about 17. And they had this child, Adele, came out the womb fully dainty, well-mannered, sanity in place, but what to do with his mother who's turned hysterical? You have to put her up in the attic.
Yeah. So yeah, she's mentally ill. She's severely mentally ill, but because of the way they dealt with mental illness at the time, they just have made it worse.
Yeah. You either have to keep it in house or put them out in a workhouse.
And it's interesting because she's off screen for most of the movie, and it's actually because they had censorships for movies in Britain about depictions of mental illness. It seems that they cut her character short because of this, and in a way made it even more offensive that she's almost like a creature, like she's a zombie up in the attic. But
Fascinated by fire.
yeah, and so the way they ended up actually cutting it back to the point where it became offensive, where if they would have filled in her character without being afraid of this censorship, it might have been a little bit better.
I think they wanted to highlight more this new prospect that Mr. Rochester was supposed to be with this woman that they have this party for, which I think it's really important to highlight that they make over this house for this party. They have to make it look beautiful in the way that Mr. Rochester needs to look appealing to everybody else.
Right.
And then she comes, she does her little aria with him playing the piano, kind of acts like a mother to Adele, and meanwhile Jane Eyre is thinking she's intruding in this place, she doesn't understand him, and really she's just out for the money versus who Mr. Rochester is as a person.
And the Jane, does Jane have a secondary? I'm confusing this with Dragonwyck, which we're going to cover next. Does Jane have a secondary love interest in this one? He has a secondary love interest.
Yes. He has an old flame who he's kind of kept tabs in, and she has to make a little bit of a trip to go to the manor, as does, ironically, to Dragonwyck, another doctor. Mm-hmm. There's a doctor that tends to Anne or the household sometimes.
That's right, and but he's like someone she knew as a child.
I think he went to...
he went to the school.
He went to the school.
So he's not as much, in the movie version at least, not as much a love interest as
someone who keeps tabs on
like
him.
He's a good influence.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's interesting, because I thought it was a pretty good movie. Mm-hmm. And apparently I looked into it after, and I don't even know if I told you this, but it gets pretty bad reviews from people who like the story.
No.
They think they cut the wrong things, and so I don't know what that entails, but for me, I wonder if it's just, it's so melodramatic, and I think that a lot of Wells's performance, puts on a weird voice the whole movie, and I think that he really just did his radio
He
version.
does sound a little bit more gruff, and I think what they really cut from Jane Eyre as the character is so much of what her inner dialogue
Right.
fills the book.
It's a lot of
has
internalized
so much
stuff.
Introspection and wondering about the unknown, wondering what the outside world is like beyond her scope, and if she's ready to go into it or not. It's like the book really or the movie really coasts over that, and she I think the reason I like the book so much is because she really muses and really concerns herself with what is unjust and what is fair and what she deserves out of this life where she started out so undervalued and people were poking and prodding her to be a certain way.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is correct, but I believe it was a pretty early example of a story being told from the protagonist's point of view with that much internalized dialogue.
But yet she's addressing the reader as a reader.
Right, and that was a kind of a unique framing device at the time. But yeah, so it's a lot of stuff you can't show on film. You just can't. And I don't know. I've only seen this version and the Fukunaga version. I thought they were both pretty similar, honestly. The Fukunaga version's longer, so it's got more going on. But yeah, I mean, it is melodramatic, and it's made at a time when melodrama was popular, and I could see that turning some people off. But at the same time, Stevenson goes all in on the Gothic.
Yep,
and
lots of fog, lots of shadows.
Shadows, fog. The building itself looks like a horror movie set.
Well, even more when it's burned down.
Yeah.
I mean, it can't help that.
But you could just show sequences out of context, and someone might assume this was a Universal horror movie.
Yes.
And I should mention that Stevenson was an A-list director. He was a big deal. But he actually became more famous in the 50s and 60s after this for making Disney movies. He made Old Yeller, both Absent-Minded Professor movies, and he made Mary Poppins. And the Mary Poppins follow-up, Bedknobs and Broomsticks. So he was a very good technical director, because those are all very special effects heavy movies. Which is interesting because those are huge Technicolor movies, and this is a black and
Very
white.
muted.
Yeah, and so it's kind of cool as a film fan to see how the range of this guy's stuff. Because I might not have known that. I would have only known his Disney stuff. Yeah, again, I also wrote another note about Beauty and the Beast because I think Disney's version of Beauty and the Beast borrowed from this story. I think that they changed the original fairy tale quite a bit to fit Jane Eyre's basic structure.
I mean, there's a little bit of Jane really getting involved with books and quoting and reading a lot. That might have contributed to Belle's, interest in books. There is a part where she goes through the main gate.
I remember there's actually a pretty good jump scare when Jane hears a scream coming from the upstairs room.
Yes.
Yeah, it's pretty effective horror movie, honestly, but it's not a horror movie. There's no ghosts. There's implications of again, emotional, spiritual damage in the house, but no actual phantoms.
Jane and Belle kind of like soften the edges of both the Beast and Mr. Rochester and the houses themselves.
Right. I was going to wrap this one up by saying there are 8 silent... this is one of the most adapted stories, I should say, in movie history, or in media history. There are 8 silent films, 16 sound films, 13 known radio plays. That's just ones that have been collected. 14 different TV miniseries versions, and then stage versions. It's been a pretty well-practiced stage play because you don't need to build a lot of sets for this particular story.
Just a school in the house.
School and maybe 2 rooms of the house. I guess one little bit outside, but you could even you could change that. He, instead of riding it on a horse, he just bumps into her in the hallway.
Impossible.
Oh yeah, there's also a series of sequels and prequels and in-between-quels told from a different character's point of view. There's comic books. There's spin-offs. It's one of my favorites is Jacques Turner's I Walked with a Zombie, produced by Val Lewton, which was actually released just before this version.
Oh.
And takes the structure. It says it's based on a novel by Inez Wallace, but it really takes the structure of Jane Eyre and puts spooky horror movie stuff over it. And then it was sold as a scary movie, but it like all these Val Lewton movies, it's actually much more of a romantic kind of emotionally spooky exploration. It's not really a horror movie by the standards of especially what a B horror movie would have been like in the 40s and 50s. Anything else about Jane Eyre that you got?
Just the fact that Rochester is usually framed by the elements, like wind and fire.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that also goes to... I think, if I'm remembering correctly, he has makeup on even to make him look ruddy.
Yes. That might be a nod to Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights being described and jeered as being a gypsy. He's definitely a dark, kind of brooding fellow.
Ethnic, quote-unquote.
Yes. Yep.
I'm sure that there's all sorts of subtext we could read into that would require another hour of speaking. So that's Jane Eyre. I like this version. I thought it was a pretty entertaining viewing.
It's a longtime favorite of mine.
And I guess if anybody else has a version they vastly prefer, like I said, I found out after the fact that this version wasn't particularly loved by people who love the book. I would be open to another version. That brings us to Dragonwyck.
Where it's the one and only version there has ever been.
Yes, Dragonwyck has only been... it's based on a 1944 book, and this is the 1946 film.
The millions who read the book club selection Dragonwyck know the powerful emotional impact of its many exciting moments. For as the Ladies' Home Journal so daringly promised when it first published Dragonwyck, this is a story to thrill the hearts of those who loved Rebecca. Starring Jean Tierney as the woman who seeks love where it is feared to flourish, this unusual, impassioned romantic drama now comes to the screen with its fascinating plot and its magnetic characters brought vividly to life by a splendid cast, including Walter Huston, Vincent Price, Glenn Langan, Anne Revere, Spring Byington, and other outstanding artists.
And you like peaches out of season, and the feel of silk sheets against your young body. And one day you will wish with all your heart you'd never come to Dragonwyck.
You knew it the instant our eyes first met, and everything within us met. And you know it now.
You have no right to say that, to talk like this, please.
You can't help yourself any more than I. Am I right?
Miranda, you understand what I'm getting at, don't you?
Yes, I think I do.
I'd like to think that you might in time marry me, Miranda.
Jeff,
I suppose you're going to say it's a man. What man, I'd like to know? She's given frostbite to every mother's son in the county.
Perhaps the right one just hasn't come along yet.
No, she won't find him with her nose stuck in the air, wanting what she can't get. A woman ought to get a man first and then want him.
Nicholas, let me help.
I don't need to be helped.
Help me, then. Please don't shut me out like this. Let me be unhappy with you and happy again. Let me be part of you. Let me love you and love me, too.
So this was a very modern take on these at the time. Mm-hmm. Anya Seton, who was also known for writing Foxfire, which was made into a Jane Russell Steamy in 1955.
Jane Russell.
Yeah.
She's so zoftig.
So, yeah. So she's known for... She wrote other stuff, too, but this was probably her most famous book. And it was directed by Joseph Mankiewicz. This was his first movie as director. He had been a writer. And not long after this, he'd made All About Eve. And then Fox started going to him for big budget things like Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. But my favorite is his last movie, which was Sleuth from 1972. Oh, yes. Love that movie. So Dragonwyck, going into it totally blind, both of us, neither of us were familiar with this story.
No.
It is so and again, this came out only 3 years after this version of Jane Eyre, which was a huge hit. To me, this feels like they were trying to remake Jane Eyre in a lot of ways. I don't know if the story is this similar.
Somewhat. As far as the time frame, yes. I read the book literally just today. It was supposed to start in 1846, and little did I know, a lot of what Nicholas Van Ryn is going to talk to her about is about the current events of the day, which is the Spanish-American War. I was very surprised about that.
Yeah. And this is a sort of magnification of a lot of things that happen in Jane Eyre. So instead of just being a brooding kind of prick who becomes a better person...
He started out a bad person.
He's a bad person, and in the movie version, he dies a bad person.
Yes.
He is a bad person the whole way through. If Vincent Price is the lead...
Yes.
And the character Vincent Price is playing is a character he kept on growing into over his career. But even at this point, he was starting to be typecast as this kind of guy. But he's still young and virile enough to be a romantic lead at this point in his career instead of just the spooky guy. This story has that. It really magnifies the religious aspects of Jane Eyre. The heroine's father is his Christianity is ruining her life in effect,
Yes, she
and
wants to leave
and her
bad.
family. She wants to get out of there. She's not picked up. She's not a foundling like Jane Eyre is.
She has parents. She has a sister. She has a household, in which she is sent a letter by the Van Ryns, sight unseen, asking them to give up one of their daughters to be sent to the Dragonwyck household.
And to act as a teacher.
That's right, to Katrine.
To their child, who is a weirdo. But
She's like a humble, kind of like homely weirdo.
Right, and
who
so
doesn't think her parents love her.
Van Ryn is absolutely obsessed with the aesthetic of wealth. If he wasn't played by Vincent Price, the charm would have been entirely lost on me. He would have been just the villain of the story. Vincent Price is good enough to push him beyond this. But so the thing is that it's magnified all these things, so it's a little bit trashy, especially compared to Jane Eyre. But like a lot of trashy horror movies, it's really a allegory for class warfare.
Class
It
warfare
really...
And like changing someone, like molding them to who you want to be. Ultimately, he wants an heir to the household.
Right, and I shouldn't even say allegory. It's like just the flat out text of it is that he's a patroon, and a patroon was a word I had to look up. A patroon is this is the definition I found on Wikipedia, a landholder with manorial rights to large tracts of land, and this is based on a 17th century Dutch colony leadership role of New Netherland on the east coast of North America.
Correct.
A patroon could create civil and criminal courts, appoint local officials, and held land in perpetuity, which is the reason he needs an heir. Yes. It was basically slavery. The people he worked for had to work for him, and he was the boss.
And he owned their land.
He owned their
They
land.
were his tenants.
They couldn't really make money off the land. They had to pay him to work, in other words.
Yes.
It was a very awful way of running things. And the story actually occurs at the end of something that ran from 1839 to 1845 called the Anti-Rent Wars, in which these renters declared independence from their patroons. And it wasn't a real war. It was a series of protests and stuff. And it didn't really tell me a lot about how it ended other than that anti-renters became a political force in New England, the New England area. And so you read the book. So I was guessing that the relationship between politics, religion, and wealth is a little bit more ambiguous than it is in the movie version.
Yes.
Because in the movie version, it is obvious and cut and dried.
He really wants it. It really could have been either Miranda.
That's
or
the
her
female
sister.
lead, Miranda. I couldn't remember her
It could
name.
have been Miranda or her sister that could have gone to see them. Either one. He just happened to choose Miranda, and Miranda was really friggin' willing to leave. He grooms her, as I quote, to be an intelligent, doting, pretty parrot, no longer of the working class. The third-person narration versus the first-person narration from Jane Eyre, she's portrayed as being very vain, taking to this whole, like, upper class very easily. She dotes upon him, even though his wife is still alive and living, and she's kind of a glutton, which is kind of a reflection of how ungodly they are. And he is openly atheistic and doesn't want Miranda and him to go to church. And in the book, they actually meet Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah. So yeah, so that means it really was trying to be it's a reflection of the this is a Gothic romance in the same way that Scream is a slasher movie.
The book itself opens with a poem from Edgar Allan Poe called Alone, and it's kind of a reflection of how Miranda will be in the book, kind of like left alone, and she'll get everything she wants but be left with nothing, and she'll have to make a choice. And what was it that he was addicted to?
He refers to himself as a drug addict at a certain point, but I don't believe that they say what I assume it's opium.
Yes, in the book it's overtly opium. He says that's what it is.
I don't think they were allowed to. There was Hays Code era rules against drug use. Mm-hmm. So I think that just saying he was a drug addict was as close as they could come to explaining what it was.
And then faced with the prospect that the current Mrs. Van Ryn, who's a glutton and really focused on getting the newest chocolates from New York City, once he knows that she can't bear his child, he poisons her very slowly with oleander.
And that's where this one, again, trashy, but in a way I actually kind of liked, where there's a part where Price, he sort of, there's the oleander that is poisoning her, and he's looking at it and saying, isn't it beautiful? And it just seems so alive that it makes you wonder if it can feel pain. And he pauses for a second and breaks one of its branches off. Because he's just that kind of person.
There's a quote that I wish they would have included in the movie that says, unfortunately, I think it has to do with the fact that he's holding an opium ball in his hand. He says, "It is no drug, but a javelin to pierce the mist which separates us from reality. It is my servant. All things are my servants, for I am the master of life and death."
Right, he is.
He is tripping balls at that point.
But that's also like his true form in a way, because there's a scene in the movie where his constituents, I don't know what you would call the people the tenants are basically, he's holding court over them. Mm-hmm. And he's
taking rent.
Yeah, and he's taking rent, and they're trying to say it's what's his name from
Harry Morgan.
Harry Morgan from MASH.
Dragnet.
Yeah, and Dragnet. Speaking with an Irish accent, he's sort of holding. It's so weird. A lot of the tenants have Irish accents in this movie, even though it takes place in New England. Yeah, maybe Irish accents are just easier. Losing my train of thought. So he's holding court over them and kind of making fun of them. But there's a part where he stops and he's asking the people with, I think it's Miranda. He's telling somebody to admire his chair. Yes. And he's talking about how old this chair is and that how it's totally worthless because no one likes it. But it's very old. And he says it represents 200 years of extreme discomfort. And he says that with happiness. That he has this chair that's very expensive and everybody hates sitting in it, but it's his and it represents his value as a person.
Mm-hmm. And his leadership over everybody else.
And there's another really good line where they're coming towards Dragonwyck, and Dragonwyck is his is a castle.
Yes.
I wouldn't say that what's his name in Jane Eyre, that's more of a giant mansion.
It's a manor.
Dragonwyck is like literally a castle on a cliff.
Yes.
That you have to take a boat to get to. Mm-hmm. And she's saying, Miranda's saying, "Oh, isn't this exciting? This is such a thrilling thing." And he replies, "Nothing is thrilling if it can be shared with other people," which is that's his ethos. Mm-hmm. And that's like the red flag that she should be seeing right there. Mm-hmm. At the same time, he is good at making her feel important.
Yes.
There's another party. Mm-hmm. Like there's that Gatsby thing where like parties represent wealth. Mm-hmm. And they're throwing a party and he tells her to go talk amongst the other people, and she tries to talk and realizes
she has to identify herself.
And she immediately identifies herself as the daughter of a farmer.
Yes.
Because she's so sick of these ninnies talking about only the famous people they know.
She feels incredibly small.
And so she's pissed off and storms away. And he recognizes, and we think at the time, he recognizes that she might leave and he loves her, so he breaks with his thing. He says earlier that he would never waltz in front of other people,
yes.
but he breaks that to waltz with her to show.
And he gives out real laughter.
Yes, and Price is very good at that kind of joyful laughter. Mm-hmm. And so you think that it's because he loves her, mm-hmm. but by the end of this version, at least, I don't know about the book, he really only wants her to have babies. He kills his gluttonous wife. By the way, in the book, is the gluttonous wife described as fat?
Yes.
Because they hire a not fat actress, and she's shoving food in her mouth, and I was thinking, I bet this character's described as fat in the book, but you just don't hire overweight actor. Or maybe that was overweight by their... that one was not overweight.
When he eventually... she's in front of her family, and she has come back to say hello and likely to stay after this trial period at Dragonwyck, after his Mrs. Van Ryn's death. And he asks them for her hand in marriage and gives her Mrs. Van Wyck's betrothal ring. And she's like, oh, what a pretty ring. He says, oh, I had to take it off of her fat finger.
Yeah. So yeah, he kills his wife. His child is just... first of all, it's a girl, so she can't...
Katrine.
She can't be the Lord.
She can't inherit.
She can't inherit. So he needs a son. And the daughter is actually, in the movie version, sort of forgotten.
Yes.
I assume she still has something to do in the book.
Nope, she's sent to boarding school.
Oh, see, they never mentioned that in the movie version. She just sort of disappears from the story.
No.
So, yeah, enough time passes that she gets pregnant, and the 9 months pass. And she becomes kind of a darker character, whereas Jane Eyre sort of finds herself and becomes a stronger character.
I think the weight of the house is like on her, and was it the former Mrs. Van Ryn, like his mother?
His mother
haunts the house.
She haunts the house. In the book, is it literal haunting?
I didn't quite catch.
No, because in the movie version, it reminded me a lot of some of the other movies that Vincent Price made with Roger Corman, the Edgar Allan Poe movies. There's a big portrait of his mother that sort of haunts him, but it's not actually haunting him. But it's still her. Yeah, the whole house has this bummer air about it, and the staff in this case are all weird.
They're suspicious of this woman.
Yeah, and they just sort of like have a creepy, like, you don't know. The staff never does anything bad to her.
No.
And in fact, she gets to bring on, when she gets pregnant, she gets to bring on her own. She chooses a sort of old Irish maid, portrayed by Jessica Tandy.
Which is funny because she's not old. She's just a young Jessica Tandy.
Yeah, and she comes in, and she has a disability, one of her legs, that I'm guessing polio or something.
Yes.
And he hates it because
yes.
she represents imperfection. Mm-hmm. And he hates it, but basically...
tolerates it because she's pregnant.
Because Miranda basically... Yeah, it gives him no other choice. Mm-hmm. And then she has the baby, and the baby dies...
In her arms, stillborn.
Almost, like that, almost immediately.
When he's about to be christened.
Yeah, no, they do christen him in time. That's right. Mm-hmm. They christen him, and then he dies. And that's when Van Ryn just sort of falls apart. Mm-hmm. And in the movie version, that's when he starts becoming a drug addict, but you just sort of assume that he's always been a drug addict.
In the book, for sure, he has been the whole time. He has a lot of bipolar tendencies. He becomes very pathological, paying attention to her, doting on her, and then, like, never wanting to be in the same room with her.
And so he blames the... There's an indication in the movie that his godlessness is a problem, which I think is another Hays Code thing. I don't know if the book was... Because, again, her dad's religion was a stumbling block for her. So I guess the movie wants her to have an in-between, be religious,
Remember
but not
the
that
part
religious.
When she said, maybe it's divine intervention that I get to go to Dragonwyck.
Yeah.
Maybe this is God smiling on me, and then it kind of changes her dad's mind.
Yeah. So she kind of inadvertently, she rolls the dice that her dad's going to open, or she opens a Bible to a random passage and points, and rolls the dice that passage that her father will read it as providence.
Yes.
And it happens. But it was total chance on her part. But we discover by the end that Van Ryn isn't even interested in romance, and maybe is not even capable of romantic love.
No.
And that he really just wanted a male heir so his land would be shared within his bloodline. He just doesn't want his wealth to be spread.
Correct.
His only reason to exist is to be wealthy and to keep wealth from other people.
I think I should highlight, too, the fact, I call him friend-zone Dr. Jeff.
Yes.
His part in this is that he comes to the rescue and hopefully to heal the former Mrs. Van Ryn when she's sick. And I think that Nicholas Van Ryn, Vincent Price's character, was trying to pin his or her death on him. And then in the book, he eventually goes to fight in the Mexican-American War and to be in New Orleans, and then come back in time for a competitive, dangerous steamboat race that
Right.
Mr. Van Ryn happens to be really into. And then in an almost like wave of providence and like good nature, he saves Miranda and somebody else from drowning and dies himself.
Right. So in the movie version, the movie version of Jeff, Dr. Turner, is Glenn Langan, who is he's a more classically handsome person than Vincent Price. And he's introduced being so salt of the earth that he willingly walks across a filthy stream. Like, the camera pans down and shows him willing to walk in the mud to come over and greet her. And it's the only person that makes Van Ryn's daughter happy.
Yes.
Like, he is such an extreme case of the better man in this situation, and he defends the workers, but he still will help Van Ryn even though he hates him because it's the right thing to do. Yeah, it takes that to quite the extreme there. But yeah, the movie ends with him and I think just him. He figures out that Van Ryn killed his wife.
Yes.
And Van Ryn actually uses him because he talks him into spending the night. So then the next morning when his wife is dead, there can be a doctor that will pronounce her dead.
Yes.
And he figures it out and he brings it to the police, and the police come to investigate. And Van Ryn threatens to kill them with a gun and ends up getting shot himself and dies.
I remember him falling on a knife.
No, he pulls out a gun and he's about to shoot, and the police have their like musket guns and they shoot him.
And he's mere steps away from that chair that he loves.
He ends
so
up
much.
landing in the chair. Yeah.
Oh.
So yeah, the movie version just flat out kills him as the villain, which again I think is a Hays Code thing, where the villain can't survive.
He has to be punished.
And so in the book version, he has a bit of a redemption. I did find that out even without reading the book.
He dies a better person.
The fiery boat crash, which they might have also cut out just because that would be a lot of money to stage a boat race, steamboat race.
I can't imagine steamboats being that fast.
Yeah. But I did like this movie because of its trashier element. There's just this open cruelty to all the characters in it. Basically everybody but Miranda and the doctor are kind of crappy. Even the workers sing songs about wanting Van Ryn to die.
Yes.
And like everybody's just angry and cruel in this whole story. And apparently the role was designed for Gregory Peck, but he got sick, and so it was handed to Price after the fact, which is just sort of a funny image of there being a place and time where Gregory Peck and Vincent Price were sort of on equal footing as possible romantic leads.
Yes.
And within 5 years, that wouldn't be the case.
Heck no.
And I'm going to wrap up this one from my end saying that Price was sort of a patron saint of American Gothic cinema, not just Gothic Romance. He was in, back in 1940, he was in Joe May's The House of Seven Gables. Then he was in this. And then he was in all the Roger Corman, Edgar Allan Poe movies but one, which included The House of Usher, which is a lot of ways the prototypical male-centered Gothic romance movie. Which, again, all these have very little in common with the Poe stories. And then The Tomb of Ligeia was another, 1965, that's another Gothic romance for sure. And then he had a guest spot in Edward Scissorhands. That's right. Which is a Gothic romance in itself, and almost in reverse, where Edward is taken from a spooky, emotionally haunted manor and brought into society and can't fit and has to go back to the spooky manor.
Yes.
And he's still... Dragonwyck happens at this time when they've stopped trying to sell him as a pretty boy, and so he is cast as the sardonic, bitchy, and magnetic villain. He would turn that more campy as his career went on, but this is like a high point for that type of character for him, I think.
If the villain in Edward Scissorhands is Anthony Michael Hall, who would the nice person be? Would that be her mom?
Her mom is
she's like a conduit for him to come.
Her mom
society.
means well, like, yeah,
And she grooms him.
Yeah.
And then ultimately, Winona Ryder's character is the love interest.
Right, and
so interesting that her mom could be the.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, her mom is sort of a lot of the town until he rejects what's her name. I can't remember that actress's name. A lot of the town is on his side throughout that movie. That movie is ultimately a very sad tale of not being able to get out of your comfort zone.
And like the makeover of the manor could be when he's showcased as a hairdresser.
Yeah, well, he also makes over the manor. He finds, he never gets to have the love anymore, but he does turn it into a beautiful place.
Yeah.
So he gets comfortable in his solitude, basically. Where Anthony Michael Hall character he's the Gaston of that story, 100%. Sure. And I also think Crimson Peak took a lot from this particular story.
Yes.
But that might just be because they both have a sort of referential quality to them. Again, it's like Scream is a slasher movie, but it's also a referential slasher movie. Whereas I feel like this is really a referential Gothic romance. And I think that in 1940s, it would have felt more like what Scream felt like in the 90s.
And that Crimson Peak, is the house called Crimson Peak?
Yes.
Crimson Peak is a lot like Dragonwyck in that it does have a life.
I keep opening my soda. I can hear it on the track. Yes, and Crimson Peak is a literal ghost story. And the what's his name? Who plays Loki is
Tom Hiddleston.
Tom Hiddleston character is not the villain in that case.
No, he's the anti-hero.
Yeah, we think he's the villain.
Correct.
So that's the version of Dragonwyck where Dragonwyck is the opposite twist. Then no, he does suck, and he's always sucked.
he has a directive. He has something in mind, an end point to this. He has to marry someone in order to fulfill the house's destiny, and then the house gets to own that woman.
Right, and again, it's all about wealth and stealing wealth, and wealth being better than love, and it's just the most villainous qualities to a person, as far as I'm concerned. Like stories about people who are murderers, but they just murder because they're compelled to murder. Those people are more likable than people who are compelled to hoard wealth.
Between the two movies, though, I want to introduce the fact that it can run in the family.
Yes.
In Crimson Peak, they are brother-sister.
Yes.
And then in Dragonwyck, they are distant cousins.
Yes.
And in Whip in the Body, they will also be cousins.
Yes, and that's another, I said House of Usher. House of Usher has a bit of the movie version has a bit of
They're sort of incestuous?
There's an incestuous love to them. I don't think that they've had actual sex, but yes, there is an incestuous quality. Well, they're one of the more modern versions of the Gothic romance would be Flowers in the Attic, which definitely has incest in it.
For sure.
So yeah, there is something about that, but that's something that I always approach as familiar relationships were different in those days. Mm-hmm. Cousins were someone you could marry without even having any. Mm-hmm. There was no social rejection of that. That was the norm for some families.
And with like familial love or like incestuous relationship, it kind of represents the end of like a really long aristocratic line where they can't be with anyone else but themselves. Yes.
Which again goes with the Gothicism has that idea. Mm-hmm. So then we'll move on. We'll jump ahead a couple decades to 1963, The Whip and the Body, La frusta e il corpo.
Ho giurato che prima di morire vedrò questa lama piantata nella gola di quell'uomo. Kurt era qui, era entrato, aveva gli stivali infangati, sembrava come se fosse uscito dalla tomba.
Ti faccio paura, eppure una volta ti piaceva.
Sì, una volta.
Ti è sempre piaciuta la violenza. Sei mia, sarai sempre mia. Io sono ritornato per te. Sono tornato per te, Nevenka, e per vendicarmi di quelli che mi odiano.
È la vendetta di Kurt. Uccidere tutti. Perché siamo tutti colpevoli. Tutti!
Smettila con queste assurdità, Nevenka. Vuoi farci diventare pazzi? Rispetta almeno il mio dolore.
This is directed by the late, great Mario Bava, who is one of my favorite filmmakers.
And I gotta add, this is your bag because this is not based on a book.
This is not based on a book, but it is sort of a roundabout adaptation of a book, because before Bava came on, the writer Ernesto Gastaldi and additional writer, God, there was so many. So, okay, the way Italian movies work is that somebody writes a script, and that script's passed around to 1 million people, and everybody involved gets to put their name on it. So this one's credited to Ernesto Gastaldi, Ugo Guerrera, and Luciano Martino. Luciano Martino is, I believe, the brother of Sergio Martino. And then probably Bava rewrote parts of it too. This was a movie that was in development before Bava came on. The writers were basically sat down, or whoever wrote the first draft, and told that the Roger Corman version of The Pit and the Pendulum was a hit. So write a version of this movie. And there is some of that in it. So it did start in a way as a literary adaptation, but it ended up not being a literary adaptation.
Like I told you when we watched it, when Christopher Lee's character meets with his family, who shun him and wishes he weren't there, the father is sitting in his easy chair in front of the fire and says, "Oh, how dare you come back after this happened, and you were shunned from this family because doing this, and that other thing." I looked at you from across the couch and I said, "Gabe, if this was a book, and if this was based on a book, this would have been like the halfway point where this character is entering, and we would have talked all about these horrible things this man had done on film before we would have gotten to this point."
Well, and also in a book, you could just have the narrator, or whoever's telling the story, explain what happened. And there's another weird thing about The Whip and the Body is that it was designed with it was designed to trick Italian audiences into thinking it was a English-made movie, which is not actually as uncommon as you would think.
If it was an English movie, you'd let Christopher Lee speak.
Right, and so, but there's also a way of the language in this movie, which is a kind of the way that characters explain the story directly to other characters.
Yes.
Is something that happens in a lot of these early-ish Italian horror movies, and I think it's just a way of storytelling for them. But I also think it's a side effect of trying to make it sound like it's British. You're watching the Italian version of a British movie is what they're trying to trick people into thinking. Bava used the, I don't know if this is the first time he used it, but he used his English language pseudonym, which is John M. Old. And his son, Lamberto, later took the pseudonym John M. Old Jr. But the reason Bava was brought on is because he was at this point, the go-to for horror, period, at this early point. Because there's not really such thing as Italian horror before 1958, 59. There are some horror elements in Peplum, Sword and Sandal movies. But so he more or less created Italian movie horror Gothic with Black Sunday, which is itself a sort of Gothic romance, and co-directed E Vampiri with Riccardo Freda the year before that, or 2 years before that, and then set the standard for color Gothic, or just color horror for Italy with Black Sabbath. And he had been making other movies in between, but was brought onto this one specifically because he was known for the producer said, "Oh, get that guy who did Black Sunday." Was if basically what happened.
I can understand how he would want it to look or seem like an English.
I got a text.
I did too. Yours just made more noise. I can see how he wants it to be seen or take 3. I can understand how he would want it to seem like a English horror, Gothic horror film, but what he's doing is a cardinal sin to me, is that he wants to tell 2 stories simultaneously. Mm-hmm. He wants it to be known that this woman who they've brought into the household has to choose between the good brother or the bad brother. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, this woman who's been working for the house a very long time is keen on getting her vengeance on the bad son or the bad brother.
Yeah,
it's the will of the house that he be dead.
Yeah, the story is a man comes to a spooky place to fulfill some kind of arranged union, mm-hmm. which tends to be what happens in the case of male. The arranged union part, a lot of the male Gothic romances, he's already met the woman and knows her, mm-hmm. and he's going to, get her for some reason.
Yes.
And he has to meet the betrothed's fucked up family, is what I wrote for a note here. In this case, it breaks from it, but the marriage arrangement fell through before the movie starts, when the asshole brother, played by Christopher Lee, whose name is Kurt, mm-hmm. Had an affair with a servant. The servant killed herself out of despair, and her mother, who is also a servant, keeps the knife that her daughter used to kill herself in this round glass thing that looks like the thing the Beast in Beauty and the Beast holds his flower in. Yeah. So Kurt returns after his brother Cristiano, or Christian, depending on which dub you're watching, who's Tony Kendall, and Tony Kendall was a pretty famous love interest type at this time in Italian movies. He marries the former betrothed, who's Nevenka, played by Dalia Lavi, who is another ace femme fatale character in Italian movies. But no one wants Kurt around because of who he is, mm-hmm. and he acts like a prick, and he is like, I'm here for my what I'm due as a family member, and I'm here to congratulate my brother, but also be shitty to him and his betrothed. And then
not trying to let on that she had a sexual relationship.
Right, and so she's like, this is awful, and I hated him, and blah, blah, blah. But then Kurt's killed under mysterious circumstances, and everyone is a suspect. So in that way, Bava, who had already sort of invented the giallo model with the girl who knew too much, is kind of turning this into a giallo. And I wonder if that was him or one of the other writers that kind of tries to turn it into a murder mystery. And I can't think of a lot of Gothic romances that are also murder mystery. There is a murder mystery aspect that there'll be a dead wife and you need to figure out if it was the Byronic hero who did it. Mm-hmm. That there is, and Rebecca has a bit of, it's not really a murder mystery, but
you get the impression that he's sorry for something.
Yeah.
And you don't know what for.
But so anyway, after the fact, Kurt's ghost starts torturing Nevenka from beyond the grave, and it's discovered that she kind of likes it. Like, he's whipping her, but she's crying and saying stop, but then also biting her finger. Like, it's a more complex movie than you think for that reason.
I think that he haunts her both from when he's alive and when he's dead.
Yeah.
Because after it's announced that his brother is going to marry her, they have a little tryst on the beach where he also whips her.
Right.
And then he leaves her out in the cold and the wet, and they have to bring her back, and she's very sick, and they think that she's going mad because of her sickness, but also she's seeing his ghost at the same time after he's killed.
And then, meanwhile, she sees that Cristiano is actually in love with Katya, who is Ida Galli, another really great Italian horror actress.
The second daughter of the maid?
Who, as I believe, she's also a servant. I'm not sure if she's also the daughter of the other servant. I never got that sense because I don't think they say her last name. But honestly, I've watched the film before and I thought she was the other woman's sister the first time I ever saw this movie. And then more people start dying, and everybody assumes that the ghost of Kurt is killing people. And then it turns out Nevenka has just gone mad, and she's basically taken on the spirit of Kurt. And she's
using the knife.
Yeah, and she's killing people with the knife So it's a movie that I think a lot of Bava purists hold up high, but I think that's because it was harder to find. It was heavily censored in America and released under a stupid title, Night of the Phantom, and just what? That was the title with exclamation point. What? It was heavily cut in Italy, too. We watched the French version, which is the only uncut version.
Okay.
And unfortunately, like all Italian movies, it was shot without sound, and Christopher Lee does not voice himself. The guy who does it does a good version of Christopher Lee, but it's not him.
We were initially fooled and thought
For a couple of lines, it sounds like younger Christopher Lee when his voice wasn't quite a baritone yet. But as a Bava fan, something I find interesting is how unromantic, like, his movies have more subtext and emotional richness than people give them credit for if they're not into him. But he's almost an anti-romantic. Hatchet for the Honeymoon is this pseudo-satire about a young man who's compelled to kill young brides, in part because he hates his wife. Blood and Black Lace has a murderous couple that end up killing each other in the end because they don't trust each other. Bay of Blood is one of the first horny teenager body count movies ever made. So I would say this because I think that Nevenka at least genuinely loves Kurt. I don't know if Kurt loves anybody.
No.
Other than Kurt. No. This has a romantic element to it. And then Danger Diabolic. Because Diabolic and Eva are also super into each other and have lots of loving scenes together. But that was in a comic. That was already established.
Yes.
I think that Bava actually likes to make fun of romance more than he likes to portray it.
With this movie not being a literature, I had to hobble and put together elements of what resembled a Gothic novel to me from this film, and I found that it was there's so much shadow, there's a lot of firelight, there's a lot of moonlight.
Yeah.
And the moonlight is oddly colored, a bluey purpley sort of color.
That might have been the fact that the Blu-ray wasn't the best Blu-ray. I'm honestly not sure because, again, there's only 2 Blu-ray versions and neither one of them looks very good. And before that, it was really hard to find. So I don't know what the color quality is supposed to be in this movie.
To me, it looked like it was perpetually nighttime.
Yeah.
Because this blue light was everywhere. And I think he tried to include a lot of fabric textures. There was a lot of velvet window dressings, curtains, lace, on people's clothing, off of a table, in your bed linens, and the kind of loopy string and piano themes just were all over it. And what I was really really taken in by the fact that the father's room the entry of it was a secret panel. You had to turn the candlestick a certain way to open it from the inside out. And then, was it a bookcase on the outside in?
Yeah, and that is an element taken directly from Black Sunday. I don't know if Bava put it in there or if whoever
Black Sunday
wrote
came later?
First. Black Sunday was the movie that made Italian horror hot, 1960. So I bet Bava didn't even put that in there. I bet that the original writer put that in there to be like Bava.
Like, thanks for that.
Well, and what's interesting about it, watching it again, is that Bava makes such great use out of no money and shitty sets that I think this was one of the times he had a little bit more money and a good set, and it doesn't look quite as good as some of the other ones. So I wonder if it was rushed or his heart wasn't as in it as some of the stuff, but some of it's really great. And Lee is having a good time.
Mm-hmm. Whether he's alive or dead.
And Dahlia Lavi, I think, is great as Nevenka. I love her in this because she's just so frantic and just over the top. I love her. That role was clearly designed for Barbara Steele, though.
Oh, yes.
She is made up to look like Barbara Steele, yeah. And Barbara Steele was in both Black Sunday and The Pit and the Pendulum. Like, they were aiming for that.
Yes.
So they didn't get what they wanted, but I still think that it's good. And I love that it delivers on the just perversion of the whole thing. That it's not afraid of the sadomasochism, which is something that, you know, a decade earlier would have not. I mean, it was cut out of most versions of it, but you wouldn't have even touched upon it. It would have been implied through language.
Before Nevenka even really gets into the whipping and the liking of it, I couldn't help but notice that what role she played was the reversal of a trope. Was that she didn't need a man to be able to transform her. She needed a man to convince her that she should snuff out their primal urges. Like, marrying the good brother would do that.
At the same time...
She would learn not to hunger for the whip anymore.
At the same time, maybe the whip wasn't the bad thing, and if her family hadn't been trying to make her stop doing that, and she would have just ended up with Kurt, and Kurt could have been a philanderer and a gross person, maybe that's what she wanted.
She wanted to be the
Maybe
lady of
she
the
wouldn't
house.
have turned into a murderer if she just got to go off and be the black sheep, you know?
Instead of it being, like, you know, forced
Yeah.
against it. Like, no, you can't have that.
Yeah. And, yeah, there's not a lot of sympathy, but one of the worst things about this movie is that Cristiano is a dumb, boring lead, which happens in a lot of male-centered Gothic movies, period, not just Gothic romances. I think it's a lot of even video games. It's just more interesting if you have this kind of Gothic story to put a female as your lead.
Yes.
That's just something that happens. And, yeah, the good men are never as... This is the note I wrote. The good men are never as interesting as the female protagonists of other stories, especially when they don't have character arcs. They never do. The women always have these broad, wide character arcs.
That guy's just static.
No,
Christian
he's
is just like, meh.
He is the
I'll
good
take what
guy
I
the
can
whole
get.
time.
Yeah.
And
he's upset when his dad dies.
yeah, because everybody would be upset when their dad died unless they really hate him. I think that, yeah, Bava's artistry and motifs are the heart of this thing. But yeah, I do have the book Mario Bava, All the Colors of the Dark by Tim Lucas, and he says the true auteur would be Ernesto Gestali. That's the note I was looking for earlier. He was the one who was asked to work on it from The Pit and the Pendulum, and apparently there's a whole list of other things that are in Gestali's other movies and stories that Lucas lists. So
like themes.
Yeah, so it's kind of his movie, and Bava made it after the fact. I would say that there are other Gothic giallo thrillers. This one is like on the cusp with the sort of murder mystery aspect, and the fact that you could argue that there is no ghost because we only see it from the point of view of the crazy character.
Yes.
But there are Gothic, even Gothic romance gialli. I think the best one would be Emilio Mirigalia's The Red Queen Kills 7 Times. That one's pretty cool. Maybe we should have watched it instead. Maybe we should have watched Black Sunday instead. I just felt like those were that Black Sunday was too obvious. Bava also did Lisa and the Devil, which is a very dreamy and experimental movie from Bava, where a woman, where the heroine basically goes to the afterlife.
Ooh.
And that's where she meets the two love interests. You also have Giorgio Ferroni's The Mill of Stone Women, Ricardo Freda's The Horrible Dr. Hitchcock, and The Ghost. He also made The Ghost. Luigi Bezzoni's The Lady of the Lake, which is sometimes that came out under Arrow Video under the title The Possessed. Antonio Margheriti's The Long Hair of Death, and maybe Joe D'Amato's Beyond the Darkness, which is a really nasty, grotesque movie. But I think the one that I wish had a better version that I might have covered if I could find a non-VHS copy of is Damiano Damiani's. It's a hard name to say. Damiano Damiani's La Strega in Amor, The Witch in Love. That's this really cool movie where a guy basically goes to an estate to I believe it's a library or some sort of whatever the estate has on. He's going there to catalog things, and there's a woman there who's either a ghost or a witch, and he's kind of warned off by another man who's already been there, saying, "You have to leave. You'll be drawn into her web." And it's a really great movie.
It's just a library.
Yeah, and also I should mention that Tim Burton and Guillermo del Toro cite Mario Bava as an influence all the time, but The Whip and the Body was hugely influential on the Pam Grier and Snoop Dogg horror movie Bones.
That's blue too.
Ernest Dickerson on the the DVD and Blu-ray extras actually points out scenes that he directly ripped off because he's proud of how he pulled them off. Which is, yeah, it seems like an unusual thing, but Bones is it's a romantic horror movie. With Gothic elements. I don't think I would call that one a Gothic romance.
Is Snoop Dogg Kurt?
Snoop Dogg is dead. Yeah, Snoop Dogg's a bit of a Kurt. Really, it's the imagery. So there's parts in Whip and the Body where Kurt's reaching out at Nevenka. In this version, Snoop Dogg's reaching out but it's a special effect. So the perspective of his hand doesn't make sense. Stuff like that. It's an interesting movie because Dickerson makes good movies, at least good-looking movies. So we're going to draw this one to a conclusion here. The other things we were thinking about covering was, of course, Wuthering Heights, which has just as many adaptations as Jane Eyre, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Both on TV and on film.
Yeah. And then I wanted to get a little different. I was thinking Ex Machina. Somebody argued that fit, and I looked into it, and it's a sci-fi Gothic romance, so I thought that would be interesting to cover. And then The Handmaiden, which is based on Fingersmith, directed by Park Chan-wook, that was going to lead me into the fact that there is a tradition of lesbian Gothic romance and just Gothic stories. Can argue that Rebecca, which we've been talking about, the Hitchcock movie from 1940, has a bit of that. Henry Georges Clouzot's Diabolique has a bit of that.
For sure. That's
more of a murder thriller, but, it's a bit of that. And the novel, how do you say this name? This is a French name.
Sheridan Le Fanu.
Sheridan Le Fanu's, I wrote 1972 novella. That's not right. No, 1772 novella, I believe. Carmilla. Is almost every sapphic vampire movie is loosely based on Carmilla. So, we'll do that some other time. But yeah, this already covered 90 minutes, so I think we're good here. So, Kristine, do you want to tell people like your Instagram or your Twitter or anything like that?
Instagram is Queenfish03, QWENFISH03. Kristine Morgan Fisher on Facebook.
And you can reach me at Gabe M as in Matthew Powers on Twitter. You can reach Genre Grinder at Genre Grinder on Twitter. The Genre Grinder Facebook page. You can talk to us on the Genre Grinder website, or you can message me at genregrinder@gmail.com. And until next time, stay spooky. And don't, get together with any Byronic heroes.
And if you walk around the house from Whip and the Body, tell someone where you're going.
Yeah, make sure you share your location. If it's a really big estate, you're going to get lost.
And talk about the scary things you just saw. Don't keep it to yourself.
Yeah, I mean, if you see a murder victim, you see a murder, report a murder. I believe they tell you that at all airports. See a murder, report a murder. All right. Bye-bye.
You're not true. I beat you black and blue. Goodbye.